The Chinese Air Force aims not just to compete with the US Air Force, but to defeat it. The Chinese Air Force aims not just to compete with the US Air Force, but to defeat it. All in pursuit of a uniquely Chinese strategy. To do so, Beijing's air arm buys technology where it can, steals or copies it where it must, and innovates new tech where there's nothing available to buy or steal. Herald's study could help to cue American military planners to U.S. forces' vulnerabilities in a war with China, as well as to China's perceptions of its own weaknesses. The People's Liberation Army seeks to compete with the U.S. military not as a goal in and of itself, but rather as a means to achieving the political goals that the Chinese Communist Party sets for the PLA, goals defined by the CCP's threat perceptions and policy ambitions. Herald writes, and defeat, not merely compete, China's view of its military aerospace goals and requirements in relation to the United States. Quotation mark. Herald lists the Chinese Air Force's strategic goals as the defense of Chinese airspace, the prosecution of a conflict over Taiwan, and the projection of power in the East and South China Seas inside the first island chain in order to prosecute claims to disputed land features in maritime spaces. To achieve these goals, Beijing's air arms relies on new and old technology, some that the Chinese government legally acquired or developed on its own, others of which it copied or stole. Chinese military aerospace power is a mix of legacy capabilities derived from the Cold War era, hardware procured from Russia and Ukraine, copies and knockoffs of Russian airframes produced by Kator through reverse engineering, a small but growing number of 4th and 5th generation fighter bombers that appear to have been developed based in part on stolen designs for US airframes, advanced, but non-stealthing, ballistic and cruise missiles, and a growing, largely indigenously developed portfolio of space and anti-space capabilities, Herald writes. Chinese aerospace firms purchased, then copied, Su-27 fighters from Russia. After receiving such technologies, sometimes in limited quantities, China has often sought to reverse engineer them to produce them indigenously, a process Chinese analysts today describe as either, or introduce, digest, absorb and reinnovate. When foreign purchases are not an option, Herald continues, China has generally sought to steal foreign technology designs or observe foreign practices with an eye toward copying and adapting them to suit the PLA's needs. Quotation mark. Perhaps most notably, Chinese hackers have stolen data related to the United States F-35 stealth fighter program. This information might have influenced the development of China's J-20 and J-31 stealth fighters. China is a world leader in hypersonics technology. And for good reason. Chinese leadership decided that super-fast munitions are uniquely valuable to the country's defensive anti-access strategy, which aims to prevent U.S. forces from operating near to China in order to, say, help to defend Taiwan from Chinese attack. No other country, not even the United States, invests in hypersonics to the extent that China is doing. Likewise, the Chinese Air Force essentially ignores whole classes of technology that it has decided do not suit its main missions. China has not chosen to put money into space-based satellites for ballistic missile early warning, the way the United States has, Herald quotes an expert as saying. Understanding the Chinese Air Force's approach to technology can help the U.S. Air Force to plan its own means of defeating the Chinese air arm in battle, Herald explains. A deeper knowledge of China's military aerospace strengths and weaknesses can help steer the USAF away from areas in which China has robust capacity and toward areas where its weaknesses could be better exploited. Quotation mark. The Chinese Air Force most directly copies the U.S. Air Force when it comes to fighters and fighter operations. The U.S. Air Force fields a high-low mix of many multi-role F-16s and F-15s and, at present, somewhat fewer specialized F-22 and F-35 stealth fighters. Similarly, China is deploying large numbers of conventional J-10 fighters, which some analysts claim Beijing based on Israeli technology, alongside a few stealthy J-20s. The U.S. Air Force emphasizes realistic training in warlike conditions. The Chinese Air Force has begun organizing its own training along the same lines. The implication is that China intends to wage an air superiority campaign roughly the same way the United States does, and is planning to defeat the U.S. Air Force on the U.S. Air Force's own terms. By contrast, in space the Chinese seem content to let the Americans deploy more and better surveillance satellites. Instead of racing the United States in space, China is building obstacles to the American solo race, in the form of anti-satellite weapons for which the U.S. Air Force has no equivalent. If China actually were to use these weapons, they could scatter debris across low orbit, denying easy access to space to every country, including itself. The implication is clear. For the foreseeable future, China will not need space the way the United States does, one expert told Herald. But China's choices could present opportunities to U.S. forces. In choosing not to develop a space-based surveillance system, China has no backup in the event that U.S. forces succeed in defeating air, land and sea-based sensors through destruction, jamming or stealth. In opting in wartime to confront the U.S. Air Force's fighter squadrons in direct fights with similar aircraft and training, the Chinese Air Force is betting that it can develop better fighters and pilots faster and in greater quantity than the Americans can do. But despite the explosive growth of the Chinese aerospace industry since the late 1990s, in 2018 American companies still produce more, and more different types of, fighter aircraft. China's Chengdu Aircraft Industries Group reportedly has produced around 20 J-20 stealth fighters since the type first flew in 2011. The U.S. Air Force alone possesses around 180 F-22 and 200 F-35 stealth fighters and continues to acquire new F-35s at a rate of around 40 per year. The Air Force plans to ramp up F-35 production to 60 annually starting in 2024.
Alright, ready, Semi?
Ready. Mistral, so we might have to stack everything a little bit higher than expected. So let me come up with AI. Follow of you guys, Polka, or no?
Your altitude for the rescue and from the rescue mission commander. Do we have any altitude?
Have you taken account the movement of the second guide?
What do you mean?
You need to
Hi, sir. Good morning again. This is Ron.
NASA is so for us,
We have a low level group here.
a nation.